I'm Bruce McEver. I'm a graduate of both Harvard Business School and Harvard Divinity School, and president of the Religious Literacy Foundation, which is the sponsor this evening. I want to welcome you to another program in the Business Across Religious Tradition series, affectionately known as BART. This series was started by the late Professor Ronald Thiemann, former dean of the Harvard Divinity School, and myself when I was a student there. And it was and is an educational outreach series aimed at business leaders. It has featured some outstanding educators across religious traditions, and tonight is no exception with Diana, discussing timely topics on the intersection of business and religion in our society. Our objective is a better understanding on the part of leaders who will hopefully set, through their thought, opinion, and actions, leadership examples for their organizations and those that surround them and they influence. Since our inception in 2006, we've had roughly 3 of these programs a year, in addition to CEO lectures featuring prominent business leaders. So we've had about 20 events in San Francisco, Cambridge, London, and mostly here in New York, here at the Harvard Club. Tonight, we are honored to have Professor Diana Eck with us, who has a dual passport. She's a professor of comparative religion and Indian studies at Harvard University and director of the Pluralism Project. Diana, who hails from Bozeman, Montana, where her mother's a state legislator was, got a college year abroad in India to study in Benares, and this really changed her life, not only putting her on the path to Indian and Sanskrit studies, but to see from her experience in India's multi-religious pluralistic society a pattern that was developing in her own country before her own eyes, in her classrooms in Harvard, in the community around Cambridge, and in the communities around the U.S. where she worked for her church, the United Methodist Church, and in nascent interfaith projects for the National Council of Churches. No one else seemed to have seen the landscape change or the pattern that was developing or studying it. Thus, now her famous Pluralism Project was born. As a scholar of India, she has published Benares, A City of Light. It's a great book, recommend it. Darsan, Seeing the Divine Image in India, and India, A Sacred Geography. She also teaches a wonderful class on Gandhi's leadership. I was privileged to actually audited a couple of those. They're wonderful. For the Pluralism Project, now more than 20 years old, she turned her attention to the U.S., documenting and interpreting its changing religious landscape of emerging Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, and Buddhist communities. She now has some 50 affiliates around the country that are mapping the diversity in U.S. cities. Pluralism Project has produced the most extensive web-based resource for basic religious literacy, On Common Ground, World Religions in America. She's also written a book, A New Religious America, or How a Christian Country Has Become the World's Most Religiously Diverse Nation, based on her work in the United States. In 1998, she received the National Humanities Medal from President Clinton for her work on religious pluralism in America. She and Dorothy Austin are masters at Lowell House, one of Harvard's 12 residential houses for undergraduates. Diana.
Well, what a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Bruce McEver, for that wonderful introduction. And to see so many of you who are graduates of HDS or of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, people that I have known in classes or as colleagues over the years, it is just a great pleasure to meet so many of you here tonight. This is a lot of fun. And I must say, as Bruce said, I started out in studying the religions of India and turned my attention, well, actually was forced to turn my attention to the United States. And India and America are sort of my 2 eyes, I sometimes say, the eyes with which I see the world around me. As American society becomes more multi-religious, as the whole world is, we do have a global workplace here with many challenges in hospitals and schools and corporate spaces. We face new prospects and new challenges. Google, for example, has its own now Buddhist meditation classes designed to bring mindfulness into the workplace. And it has a conference called Wisdom 2.0 every year, a conference that aims to empower entrepreneurs and business leaders with deeper wisdom and compassion and awareness in the digital age. And then, of course, there's all the work on Islamic banking in America. And these conferences on Islamic banking take place regularly at Harvard University and elsewhere. And then Harvard Business School, studying in its cases whether yoga can be patented, as Bikram Choudhury has done with his hot yoga. At the same time, Hindus launch a Take Back Yoga campaign. And as we know, the US Supreme Court ponders at this very moment whether a for-profit family business, the Hobby Lobby, owned by the Green family, devoutly Christian, can be considered a religious organization and qualify for certain abortion-related exemptions from the Affordable Care Act. And a school principal in Florida wonders what to do when he notices the bright red letters emblazoned on the back of a girl's t-shirt saying, "Islam is of the devil." So these are questions, challenges of leadership in so many spheres that people in our society increasingly face. And this year, as you know, is the 50th anniversary of so many great events in US history, among them the historic Civil Rights Bill. And if we cast our minds back to the time of the 60s, we defined ourselves largely as Christian, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish. That was, in fact, the title of Will Herberg's sociological study, Catholic, Protestant, Jew. And this photograph of Abraham Joshua Heschel marching arm in arm with Martin Luther King in the front row of marchers in Selma has become a kind of icon of those times. And the 1964 Civil Rights Act that we are just now celebrating the 50th anniversary of, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act were two of the three major pieces of legislation addressed to deep issues of race and equality in America. But there was a third, and that was the 1965 Immigration and Nationalities Act. As Robert Kennedy, you can see him here somewhere, there he is, Robert Kennedy, Attorney General at the time. When this legislation was proposed, he said, "We cannot be working to eliminate racism in every aspect of our national life and still have it as the foundation and cornerstone of our immigration policy." So this was signed into law at the base of the Statue of Liberty by LBJ. He said at the time, "This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill. It does not affect the lives of millions. It will not reshape the structure of our daily lives or really add importantly either to our wealth or our power. Yet it is still one of the most important acts of this Congress and of this administration as it corrects a cruel and enduring wrong in the conduct of the American nation," end quote. And he was very right about that. In the conduct of the American nation since 1882, we had basically Asian exclusion legislation passed again and again. It did correct an enduring race-based wrong, but he could not have been more mistaken about what it would mean for America, which was a new religious landscape, literally from the Silicon Valley to MIT, and all the wealth that that would produce. And as for me, in that year, 1965, when that legislation was passed, I dove into the ocean of the study of religion and the study of India as a student. And I had no idea that I would surface in a little more than a decade's time on the shores of a US suburb of Boston, where they were dedicating a Hindu temple. I had no idea, as most of us did not, how much this legislation would change America would change, in fact, my chosen field of study, the comparative study of religion. The immigration that followed the 1965 Immigration Act included many of the communities I'd studied in India, and it opened the door to immigration from all over the world, not just from Europe. It's changed forever that we the people of the United States of America. By the 1990s, they were dedicating a Hindu temple in the suburbs of Boston with the waters of the Mississippi mingled with the waters of the Ganges, and I realized that I needed to know more about what was happening in my own country. And that was really the genesis of the Pluralism Project in 1991. We realized that these immigrants who had come from all over the world came with their Qurans and their Bhagavad Gitas and their Buddhist rites and rituals, and asked ourselves, what are the religious dimensions of America's new immigration? And as Harvard students explored the new landscape, we also attracted colleagues from other colleges and universities across the country. We asked three kinds of questions. The first of them, who's here? In cities and towns all across the country, beginning in Boston, where we did preliminary research, we had students and colleagues who went out to find out what kind of Hindu temples are there. For example, in Minneapolis, here, where an affiliate of our project, Shauna Sippy, at Carleton College, studied the Hindu temple of Maple Grove, which you see here from the air, a magnificent new Hindu temple. There were Hindu elected officials. There were Hindu temples in hundreds and hundreds of cities as eventually this landscape began to change. It is one of 1,000 temples and mosques and Sikh gurdwaras in the United States. So our first question was try to ask, not in a demographic way, but basically city by city, what kinds of religious institutions are here that we didn't know before? A second question was, how are these traditions changing in the American context? For example, here in Welford, South Carolina, Cambodian monks and laity, including a Euro-American monk, are carrying a casket containing a bone relic of the Buddha that would be enshrined in a stupa. Where? In South Carolina. How are our religious traditions changing as they put down roots in the American context? And the third of our three questions, not just who's here and how are our traditions changing, but how are we as people, we the people of the United States, changing? We who now graduate from college in mortarboards and hijabs. These were the questions we set out to find out more about in the Pluralism Project. And the demographic changes of the American population over these past 50 years make it more urgent than ever that we know more about this, that we think about issues of identity, national, regional, colleges and universities, and corporations, and in public space. Who are we? How do we deal with our differences? For religious difference is increasingly part of our lives, no matter where you live. In his first inaugural address, President Obama spoke of our patchwork heritage, and I love this photograph. It's from a time when I was invited to speak in a Jewish-Christian relations panel in Palm Beach. And they had had the children in the Palm Beach schools do images of We the People or of E Pluribus Unum from many one, and this was one of them. It is a kind of patchwork. President Obama said, "We are a nation of Christians and Muslims, Jews and Hindus, and non-believers. We're shaped by every language and culture, drawn from every end of this earth." Now, in that inaugural address, President Obama spoke of this as an achievement, and it is, but it's also an ongoing challenge. This isn't over. From Many One describes that American challenge, and many people would agree with Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., who wrote a really interesting book that was titled The Disuniting of America, in which his salient phrase was, "There really is too much pluribus here and not enough unum." So how do we deal with that? Those people who crafted the Bill of Rights and wrote that famous First Amendment, that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, those people could not really have imagined the religious diversity of America today with our Hindu and Muslim and Jain and Buddhist citizens. They were 16 simple but revolutionary words: no established state religion, freedom of religion, and that is a blueprint for the religious diversity that we have in our midst today. As Hindu priests sit at the oldest of altars, a Vedic fire altar, and perform the rites that are necessary for the consecration of a temple. Or as Boston suburban women circle the temple with pots of water, ready to enter and pour it on the images inside. They remind us that free exercise has long been part of America's constitutional covenant. But it is a covenant that we still have to make good on year by year. The neighbors of other faiths we have today are not imaginary people on the other side of the world, but across the street. Hindus are not a large minority, but a vibrant minority with, I might add, as the Pew Research Institute found it 2 summers ago, a minority with the highest salaries and the best education of any subgroup in the United States. They built landmark temples in places like Pittsburgh, which was one of the earliest, the Sri Venkateswara Temple, in places like Calabasas, California, in dozens of other cities, magnificent temples designed by Hindu temple architects and erected by American engineering firms, and Gujarati Hindus who have built marble slab by marble slab, huge temples in London and New Jersey and here in Houston, a beautiful temple that opened just a few years ago. And at Harvard as well, change is visible not just in these suburban temples, but in universities. The Holy Springtime Festival of Colors, celebrated so vibrantly in India, is observed by Harvard's Hindu students and their friends with incredible gusto, and it's become a kind of ritual spring festival. This is the Mac Quad, for any of you who know Harvard landscape, right outside the master's residence of Lowell House and across the way Kirkland House. An amazing new institution of Harvard undergraduate life put on by Hindu Dharma. And the cultural festivals, like the South Asian students who put on an annual blockbuster cultural program called Gungaru, showcasing dance and music and drama from their parents' homeland, often mixed in fusion with their own American dance traditions. And Buddhists as well. The massive migration of people, whether immigrants, economic migrants, or refugees, has changed the map of nations and cities and neighborhoods. It's changed the local reality, as here in Seattle, where a small home temple observes summer rites in the backyard, one of dozens of home temples in Seattle and other cities, where migrants, immigrants, in this case refugees from Vietnam and also from Cambodia, have established their own temples in small suburban homes. The Asiatic Exclusion League, when it started its rather virulent work in the late 1890s, said the Asiatic race and the Caucasian race could never exist in the same territory. Their morals, philosophy, religion, education, standard of living are opposite, as far apart as 2 poles. They can never blend, and they best would confine their operations to that portion of the earth given them as home by God. That was Asiatic Exclusion League in 1907. And now, of course, if one were to look at the Harvard Register of Undergraduates, you would find something like 42 Chens, 22 Smiths, 4 Joneses, and 12 Nguyen's, and 46 Zhangs, and 33 Lees, and 55 Lees, if you spell it with E-E. I mean, amazing diversity. Harvard is literally about a 5th Asian in terms of its population. But not only these Vietnamese monks, but Cambodians have come to the area around Boston in great numbers. in the last 4 to 5 decades came as refugees from that turbulence of a war in Southeast Asia. Here, the Cambodian monks settling in Lowell and Lynn, this a converted Methodist church in Lynn, and Chinese as well, Taiwanese immigrants have created temples like this great Thousand Buddha temple within a stone's throw of John Quincy Adams' birthplace in Quincy, and a place where they gather on weekends, really hundreds and hundreds of Chinese Americans in the confines of this temple. And then the largest Buddhist temple in the Western Hemisphere on the hills of Hacienda Heights, just east of Los Angeles, a temple created by monks and nuns from Taiwan around a globalistic, humanistic Buddhist movement called Fo-Kuang, and dedicated to building the Pure Land right here on earth. And this temple, very interestingly, the architect's drawing of the largest Thai temple outside of Thailand being dedicated in just a few weeks in Raynham, Massachusetts, built by Thai immigrants to the United States, and built here because the current king of Thailand was, if you will believe it, born in Mount Auburn Hospital. So they have a particular dedication to the New England area. And here in New Bedford at the Whaling Museum, one of these events that we have seen repeated time and again in the United States, where Tibetan monks painstakingly create a mandala, a sand mandala, grain of sand by grain of sand, in a space that will take them a couple of weeks to execute, and then with a prayer, sweep it away, somehow demonstrating very clearly the transience of life that is so much part of the Buddhist community. And there in New Bedford, through the streets, carrying this sand and pouring it into the New Bedford harbor of Moby Dick fame, where one does not necessarily expect Tibetan monks. And this is a new world of encounter, a brand new world of encounter for many, many Americans. And with Islam too, Muslims have broken ground for new mosques and Islamic centers. Here in Sharon, for example, more than 20 years ago, when the Islamic Center of New England broke ground on a former horse farm, a rabbi turning a shovel of dirt, the representatives of the Catholic and Orthodox churches looking on, a revolution of building of Islamic centers across the country. And in downtown Boston, at Roxbury Crossing, the Islamic Society of Boston built a landmark temple. Here is Salma Kazmi, who was also a graduate of Harvard Divinity School in community relations, leading civic leaders through the project as the mosque went up, patiently responding over and over to the accusations in the press that somehow there was radical funding behind this mosque. And for all of us deeply interested in state, local, national government, there is almost no place where these issues of conflict and identity are not controversial. And we watched this mosque go up. It was controversial. We saw the minaret and the capping of the minaret. We were there on the morning when ISBCC, the Islamic Society of Boston Cultural Center, was dedicated. Mayor Menino was there. There were hundreds and hundreds of Muslims there, and still the press went to the protesters across the street, just a few of them covered by Fox News, who were critical of the Islamic Center and whose critique really continued unabated. But mosques are part of our landscape, literally across the country. Toledo, Ohio, this community that was indeed hit by rifle fire on the night of September the 11th, 2001. And immediately, 2 nights later, a circle of some 2,000 people gathered at the mosque to gather and hold hands around the mosque, as if to say, this is not who we are, not in our community, not in our town, in this small suburb of Toledo. The mosque in Cleveland can also be startling to Americans who simply don't know their Muslim neighbors. And the same with the mosque in Jacksonville, or many others. Almost any of these, you can say, there was an arson attack here, there was some sort of controversy there. And here in New York City, one that all of us have seen, the mosque at 96th and 3rd, the largest and most magnificent of literally dozens and dozens of Islamic centers, storefront prayer rooms throughout the boroughs of New York, now with a school actually attached to it as well. And as for Sikh communities, many of them look just like this. A former automotive supply building in Medford, Massachusetts, the brilliant golden flag of the Sikhs flying, indicating that there's a gurdwara there, a place where Sikhs gather, largely on the weekend, mainly on Sunday, for worship and for langar, for the great feast that accompanies Sikh worship. And in the suburbs, this ordinary building, its parking lot jammed on a Sunday morning, distinctive again for its gold-wrapped flagpole. And yet across the country, there are many gurdwaras that look as splendid as this one in San Jose, and that bespeak a tradition that has come to America to stay. And the Sikh summer camps that enable Sikh teens to know one another, to learn about their tradition, modeled very much on the fashion of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim summer camps. There are many cases involving the religious freedom and free exercise of Sikhs in the US. The military was long reluctant, and it was just 2 years ago when, for the first time in history, the Army commissioned its first turbaned Sikh to serve. And we all know that in the aftermath of 9/11, the Sikhs were among the first targeted because of their turbans. Here, Balbir Singh Sodhi, who was killed, the gentleman in the photograph, held by his brother, killed in Mesa, Arizona, because he was somehow seen as associated with those turbaned people of Al-Qaeda. And it does take a tragedy somehow, a controversy, to bring critical issues to the forefront. For 2 years ago in the summer in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, we saw yet again the cost of indifference to religious difference. The Sikh community had built a new Gurdwara, a Sikh temple as they called it, from the ground up. Millions of Americans saw this community, a Sikh community, for the first time when in August its Sunday service was disrupted with gunfire from a white supremacist and many people killed, both Sikhs, a police officer, and the assailant himself. A hate crime with its roots in ignorance and prejudice has been part of American history for a long time, and especially as we become more diverse culturally and religiously. It's of deep importance to know more about our religious diversity, and we know that Sikh outreach groups like the Sikh Coalition have worked over the years to provide outreach to law enforcement, to people who need to understand the wearing of turbans, of other symbols of the Sikh faith. And in the aftermath of Oak Creek, we understand how important that outreach can be. I was recently giving a lecture in Berkeley when a Sikh gentleman who came to the lecture just so he could talk to me said that he had used the resources of our web-based On Common Ground as part of the work that he has done for years to educate people about the Sikh community, the people in law enforcement in particular. And we have a sense that this has entered the leadership of public life as well. It was just in this last month that Indiana Congresswoman Susan Brooks visited a Gurdwara in Indianapolis. Now, it happened to be the first time any congresswoman, or any congressman for that matter, had ever visited a Gurdwara, in Indiana at least. And we have other emblems of the sort of beginnings of the transition in public life, landmarks of a new reality, like Keith Ellison, the first Muslim elected to the US Congress, hailing from the state of Minnesota, taking his oath of office on a copy of the Quran owned by Thomas Jefferson. Or, more recently, Tulsi Gabbard, a first Hindu elected member of Congress from Hawaii, sworn in on the Bhagavad Gita. So diversity is a fact of American life, more visible now than ever before. pluralism does not mean diversity pure and simple. It's what we make of that diversity in building a common society. There are lots of places in the US, if we ask the question, how are we doing, where we can see the juxtaposition of religious communities architecturally, side by side, as here in San Diego, where the backyard and the cross of Atonement Lutheran Church shares a wall with the Islamic Society of San Diego. Or here in a site that we've studied for almost 2 decades now, a Methodist church and a mosque in the East Bay in Fremont, California, that built side by side on a frontage road that they called Peace Terrace. And now there's really a rather spectacular mosque, and as Methodists go, and I'm a Methodist myself, a rather homely Methodist church on that site, but they have shared much over these years, and these are the experiments in our religious diversity. People talk about celebrating diversity, and of course there's a lot of celebration, but this is not the only thing we need to think about. Here, this is Peace Pagoda, not too far from Amherst on a hilltop. And what we really need is not simply to celebrate one another, but to know a lot more about one another than we do. And most of the students in the classes that I teach are not likely to be in the life of religion. They're likely to be in any other field, as most of you are here today. And talk about controversies, you can almost feel the heat in this one. From Murfreesboro, Tennessee, in the summer of 2010, where there were demonstrations and counter-demonstrations, the man with the flag being against the building of a mosque in the outskirts of Murfreesboro. This is not what the founders had in mind, he said. Our country was founded through the founding fathers, the true God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. And the one with the sort of cardboard in the background quoting the Bible as well, saying, I command you to love one another. The young person, maybe from Murfreesboro, coexist with the cardboard. But what was this all about? It was about the building of a mosque, the siting of a mosque, the future site of the Islamic Center of Murfreesboro. And so the demonstrations began. Before long, not the future site of the Islamic Center of Murfreesboro. And a little after that, the mosque, the sign itself was vandalized. But actually, 2 years later, that mosque was built. And this is a drama all its own. This was dedicated, in fact, almost the same day as the shooting in the Oak Creek Temple in Wisconsin. But these kinds of signs, this is not your country, give us pause as we think about the conflicts and encounters that are part of the U.S. today. How are we doing with this changing religious landscape? And that's where the case studies that I've been developing with the Pluralism Project come in. Because case studies are really ways of bringing reality into the classroom, difficult situations with conflicting interests that require critical thinking and creative responses, require us to know more than we do now, to do some research, to think in a new situation. And they preview some of the complex decisions that confront all of us as citizens, as civic leaders, as corporate managers in a multi-religious society. So let me give you some examples of what my students struggle with. Consider our neighbor in Cambridge, Jeff Young, superintendent of schools, came into office in 2009, and before his first year was up, faced a critical decision. The Cambridge Public School Committee received a formal request to add a Muslim holiday to the school calendar. They wanted to add Eid to the calendar, either Eid al-Adha or Eid al-Fitr, one of the two big Islamic holidays, whichever fell during the school year, one of them. Not just for Muslim students, that would be a no-brainer, but for everyone. So what was he to do? Young, his first response was, this was hard. On the one hand, I had just got here, and I wanted this issue to go away. And yet he realized that this was a really interesting and important social justice issue. It touched on his fundamental belief in equality. and it was a question of basic fairness. So what did he need to know about Eid? When is it celebrated? How is it celebrated? Should they get a day off, as Jews do, as everyone does, for Yom Kippur in a school district like Cambridge? What do you think? How should he decide? Is it a matter of numbers? How many Muslim students and faculty are in the school? What happens then when Hindus petition to add Diwali? Or how do we know how the Muslim calendar is organized? Or how is it different from the Hindu calendar? He'd been in Cambridge only 6 months when this happened, but he thought, I'm trying to choose my battles in this job, and this is not the one I really wanted to pick. And they thought of the parents who were sort of inconvenienced with another day off. He thought of unions who had contracts. He thought of snow days and how many there were. Would this be a slippery slope? How many of you think he should decide to give Eid off for the whole school district? Yeah, oh, well, there are a few of you. Mayor Bloomberg didn't think this in New York, by the way. How many of you think it's not a good idea to go down this slippery slope? There are a few of you there, too. Yep. Okay, we'll talk about it. I'm not going to tell you what happened. That's the whole point. I mean, this is a really discussable issue. Or what if you were Tom Farrell, superintendent in Aspen, Colorado, who decided to launch a yoga ed program to enrich physical education in the schools? When the elementary school principal met with him, he thought, this sounded great. Yoga ed, developed in California, proponents said it improved academic achievement, physical fitness, flexibility, emotional intelligence, stress management. Who was not for this? It made total sense. Better for the students' health. Little did he anticipate the calls and concerns. Wasn't this introducing a form of spirituality? Was it Hinduism? He soon realized we had to make sure we were clear that this was a separation of church and state kind of thing. We were blindsided, he said, even in Aspen, Colorado. We weren't ready for it. He had never expected the fear that people found. Even in Aspen, for some, yoga was a 4-letter word, loaded with a highly debated history. The founders of Yoga Ed said we'd strip away everything. We won't talk about asanas or namastes, nothing. We won't use any Sanskrit except the word yoga. A nationwide debate was also raging, with Deepak Chopra and others saying, this isn't Hindu, it's not even religion. It's just an old tradition of physical and mental discipline. And the Hindu American Foundation and others insisting that yoga is part of the heritage of the Hindu world. So what steps should Tom Farrell take as they debate the implementation of yoga ed in the schools? Or how about this one? The College of William and Mary, almost as old as Harvard, a landmark building, their administrative building, contains a chapel said to have elements of the design of Christopher Wren. Here's the chapel right here. It had Phi Beta Kappa initiations, weddings, symbolic events of symbolic importance. But what about the cross on the altar? Of course, historically, it was affiliated with the Church of England, but today, what should they do? The new president, Jean Nichols, a constitutional lawyer, wondered, along with others, if maybe the cross might be put in the closet as a default position, and then moved to the altar if there were a Christian service or something like that. And he instructed the tour guides that this would be the case. Within a week, the issue blew up. Some alumni heard it was taking the altar off the cross. It was on Fox News, of course. A campaign was launched called Save the Cross. A web appeal went out, no cross, no cash. How could Jean Nichols contain this situation? What should he say? What should he do? What is a university anyway? Is it just the students who happen to be walking around and the faculty? What about the alumni, the trustees? What happened to Jean Nichols? Does anyone know? He eventually lost his job over this. An amazing issue of university management. And then there are workplace questions. One case describes the many sides of a controversy that begins right here in that ubiquitous duty-free shop in an airport, wherever. Beginning in 2002, the airport staff at Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport became aware that passengers who were carrying alcohol, often visible in the plastic bags from duty-free shops, were refused taxi service. The drivers, many of whom were Muslims from Somalia, explained that their faith did not permit them to consume or to transport alcohol. Steve Wertham and his colleagues at the Metropolitan Airport Commission, the regional governing body for the airport, found this issue troubling and had to think about what to do. This has the highest percentage of Somali refugees in the US, in Minneapolis-St. Paul, and nowhere are we closer to Mogadishu than in the airport, where 80% of the cabbies are Muslim. Accommodating Muslim cabbie drivers was a big issue. There was prayer space while they wait, and then the alcohol issue. Service refusals were prohibited by the taxicab ordinance. Drivers who refused were sent to the end of the line, had to wait maybe 2 hours for another fare. For the drivers, this was an issue of religious accommodation. For those in charge of the taxi line, there were endless passenger complaints. Passengers were moved from one taxi to another. Those who were refused service were confused and frustrated. One threw a bottle of wine on the pavement in anger. What should the airport authority do? Now, Steve Wertham designed a series of meetings and negotiations with all stakeholders, public, airport management, taxi drivers. Each would get a chance. At the second meeting, the taxi drivers came forth with a fatwa, a religious opinion that for them was non-negotiable, that said they could not transport alcohol in their taxis. Well, they finally found a proposal that seemed an option. There would be a green light on the taxis that would not take alcohol, so there would be no confusion. The moment the top light solution came forth, Daniel Pipes, often blogger and columnist, who has his own kind of cottage industry on thinking about Islam in America, wrote, "The proposed solution has massive and worrisome implications. Namely, the two-light plan intrudes Sharia or Islamic law with state sanction into a mundane commercial transaction in Minnesota. A government authority thus sanctions a signal as to who does and who does not follow Islamic law." This was not only a workplace issue, it became a very heated civic issue in Minneapolis. What are all these Somalis doing here to begin with? How can we accommodate such a large refugee population? Another workplace issue. The morning of September 11th, a Sikh train operator for the MTA here in New York, which makes stops in Lower Manhattan, was headed toward the World Trade Center. And just as the first tower collapsed, this man, Kevin Harrington, with the white turban, reversed his train and backed it up step by step by step and saved dozens, if not hundreds, of passengers in the process. He was recognized as a hero for this work. However, in subsequent months, the MTA decided that it would not be a good idea for him to continue driving the MTA train wearing a turban unless he put a logo on it that would indicate that he worked for the MTA. Now, he had been driving a turban for a long, driving a train for a long time, and Sikhs are required to wear their turban and leave their hair unshorn. But after 9/11, turbans and beards became markers of suspicion and public unease. And the MTA informed Harrington that if he wanted to continue wearing his turban, he would have to put that MTA logo on it. Harrington understood the stakes, but he considered this a kind of sacred space, and he was not going to do that. Eventually, that meant he would either have to lose his job or work in the MTA yards out of view of the public. It was only after considerable controversy that the New York City Council voted to eliminate the branding of the turban. And another example, this gentleman, Parvez Ahmed, professor of finance at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville, nominated to the Human Rights Commission, but his appointment challenged at every step by those who insisted that he had at one time been involved in groups that had made extremist statements, the main group being the Council on American Islamic Relations. Now, he had been an active public figure in Jacksonville. He had been involved, he'd lived there 26 years, been involved in the interfaith council called One Jacks, wrote for the Jacksonville newspaper, wrote for Huffington Post, had his own blog on Muslim participation in public events. But almost as soon as he was nominated, the Jacksonville chapter of Act for America took to the streets with pickets insisting that he was a radical in sheep's clothing. So this case poses a real question of how one responds to the vociferous attacks of people who are trying to diminish one's public standing. And this group, Act for America, dedicates itself under the leadership of Lebanese-born Brigitte Gabriel to exposing radical Islam in our midst by informing and educating citizens on the insidious nature of what they call stealth jihad and mobilizing to defeat the spread and implementation of Islamic Sharia law. This is what they felt Parvez Ahmed was up to. And that term then came into use. This term, stealth jihad, this is particularly the term of Robert Spencer, who wrote the book on this, no longer about terrorism and overt violence, but about nice people, citizens like Parvez Ahmed and others, trying to take over our country. So to study religion in this kind of environment, you really have to run to keep up. And of course, we might as well close then with the story of Imam Faisal Rauf and his wife Daisy Khan, long involved in interfaith work in the city of New York, who dreamed of something called Cordoba House, an interfaith, Muslim-sponsored education and dialogue center. He met a man named Sharif Al-Gamal, a developer, who'd been looking for a good place in Lower Manhattan to establish a Muslim community center, a fast-growing area of the city. But as Gamal put it, we don't have a community center at all. At the end of the day, I'm a New Yorker, and there are Jewish community centers all over the city. I see a Muslim community center as a way of giving back to the people. Daisy Khan, Faisal's wife, also involved in the project, involved in women's leadership and initiative in Islam, both in the US and worldwide, empowering Muslim women to play a greater role. So their vocational vision was sort of coming together, along with that of Sharif Al-Gamal in Lower Manhattan. At its meeting on May 5th, 2010, all 15 members of the Lower Manhattan Community Board were in favor of the project, seeing it as a positive move that would bring jobs and new vitality, cultural events, recreation, and community life to an area near the World Trade Center that was desperately in need of rebuilding. The next morning, however, after the Lower Manhattan Board had approved this project unanimously, when Faisal Rauf and Daisy Khan opened the papers, they saw the meeting of the community board reported this way in the New York Daily News. What was approved was described as a 13-story mosque to be located steps from ground zero. And then it began. The energies of the blogosphere operating at full force, it became the Monster Mosque, the Victory Mosque, ultimately known as the Ground Zero Mosque. Labeling was the first and the most lasting victory of the opponents. And the message that began to take hold in the summer of 2010 and gained purchase was not simply stop the Ground Zero Mosque, but stop the Islamization of America. And at first, the protesters said this was about sensitivity to the proximity of a mosque to Ground Zero. Soon it became clear, however, that this was not really about the siting of a mosque at all, but about Islam itself, about Sharia law. Here, the name dripping with blood comes to symbolize the very nature of Islam. And we began to hear in our vocabulary that term Islamophobia. Much of the labeling and media heat could be attributed to this conservative blogger, Pamela Geller, who, along with Robert Spencer, had launched this effort, Stop the Islamization of America. What could be more insulting and humiliating, she said, than a monster mosque in the shadow of the World Trade Center, buildings that were brought down by an Islamic Jihad attack? And here, we see that the same forces that were there in the streets of Lower Manhattan were there wherever mosques were cited to be built that summer, here in Sheepshead Bay in Brooklyn, or on Staten Island, or in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, or in California, Temecula, California, all of them participating in the same signage, Stop the Islamization of America. Of course, the flames that summer were fanned by the fact that this was the 2010 midterm election, with all of the things that were indicated by the Tea Party and others in relation to their opposition to Barack Obama. Now, let me just say that in each of these cases, there are people on the other side, the protesters, the counter-protesters, many of them people who are part of a growing interfaith movement in New York and elsewhere. Say no to hate. When one is oppressed, all are oppressed. And throughout the world, as we become much more urbanized, Jeff Sachs wrote a book a few years ago called Commonwealth, Economics for a Crowded Planet. And he spoke of our century as the urban century. And indeed, it is true that everything, transportation, infrastructure, health, poverty, is urbanized. But among the other things that are urbanized and symbolized by the great bridges that symbolize the broken and important, yet very important infrastructure of urban centers all over the world, among the very things that are urbanized are also the people. Jeff Sachs doesn't talk about that, but the fact that people with their prejudices and their differences are also concentrated in urban areas more intensively than ever before, in ways that call for a kind of infrastructure that we in the Pluralism Project think of as the interfaith infrastructure in cities and towns across the country. And this map, which is part of our own website, is a pilot project of 20 cities only, but we've worked far beyond that on the ways in which this movement toward building bridges, if you will, between people of different faith communities in urban centers around the country and indeed around the world, this movement, without a single head, without a single organization, is actually a very broad and widespread movement. And we have just examples of it: Women Transcending Boundaries in Syracuse, or the Amazing Faiths Dinner Dialogues in Houston, or countless local initiatives in cities and towns across the country, or the Tri-Faith Initiative in Omaha, Nebraska, where a Jewish synagogue, an Episcopal diocese, and an Islamic center are all building on the same property. Now, this synagogue is actually finished now. The Islamic Center still in its planning stages. And then perhaps a good one to close with for a group like this, the Ford Interfaith Network, where perhaps for the first time, a major corporation has established an interfaith network as part of its workforce. It has over 100 plants, of course, in places around the world, in Thailand, in Brazil, in South Africa, and its corporate headquarters is in Dearborn, Michigan. which also has one of the oldest and largest Arab American populations in the U.S., where the first mosque in Dearborn was built in 1911. So the Ford Interfaith Network, or FIN, to assist the company in becoming a worldwide corporate leader in promoting religious tolerance, corporate integrity, and human dignity. And at Eid al-Adha, in their most recent celebration just last fall, their motto was building it together, one Ford, one community. That people of all faiths need to get past tolerance and move on to cooperation. And it's interesting to see this embedded in one of the great corporations of America. So let me close just with a view. What is pluralism anyway? It's not diversity alone, but that kind of energetic engagement with diversity that is about the building of a common society. Pluralism isn't just tolerance, as the people at Ford well knew, but the active seeking of understanding across lines of difference. And pluralism isn't relativism, but the encounter of real commitments. And finally, that pluralism is based on that particular kind of dialogue that involves listening and speaking, the kind of dialogue that our case studies courses are really intended to facilitate, where students come not to listen to me speak, but to listen to one another and to participate actively in the dialogue about some of the difficult situations that arise in education, in civic life, in public life, and in university life, and indeed in corporate life, as people of many religious traditions and none come together in a common place. So as a teacher and researcher, our work grows, and our students grow as well. We're about the Pluralism Project, but actually the project of pluralism is something that is on the agenda of virtually everyone in wherever their place of work or life may be in the United States, and indeed in most of the great countries of the world that are multi-religious as we are. So I'd like to stop here and go to some questions. I'd be happy to have questions from you. And I think one of the things that we're encouraged to do is to have those questions, sort of questions with a question mark at the end of them, rather than, I'm sure that this group has a lot of contributions as well, but let's start with questions of that sort. Yes, Professor Isaac.
Thank you. Your lecture reminded me, Professor Arthur Garbenok's book, Conversion. Do you think, of course, that book says that the pluralistic interaction of all the different religions, Judaism, holistic religions, literal religions, Zoroastrianism, and the conversion of those religions was what led to the birth of one single new religion called Christianity. This happened 2,000 years ago. And your lecture really, brought, I'm sure he was also, at one time, your colleague, master of Eliot House. Do you think there is such a potential that we might see a new religion emerging in the United States, in the new empire?
Well, there might be some new religion emerging. I would say it's not likely to be an umbrella religion like Arthur Darby Knock might have said about Christianity. I mean, the interesting thing is that he, as a scholar of religion, wrote about the ancient Mediterranean, very famous for his work on Gnosticism, but that was a place where, it was bubbling with lots of different religious ideas. And in some ways, the United States today is like that, a place where people of different religious life, we don't necessarily call them cults now, but they might be, various forms of worship, live closer together than ever before. So what is happening? there are a lot of things happening. I mean, to some extent, people are finding that they may partake of more than one religious tradition, either by marriage or by the fact that they have, come to one of my classes and were deeply moved by the Bhagavad Gita and haven't been able to get it out of their mind, even though they are, going on about the business of being Episcopalians. I mean, these are some of the things that the kind of environment we have produces, I think. Other questions? Yes.
Amy and I have a question. We always understood that tolerance was least broad in the countryside and most broad in the urban areas, but you seem to say it was the reverse, so we're confused.
Well, I don't know where, I mean, tolerance, the sort of thermometer of tolerance is hard to gauge. I think in urban areas, there is a lot more necessity of rubbing shoulders with people of various faiths and ideologies. So one of the things that people will often say, my colleague Robert Putnam, in looking at these things sociologically, says that a lot of your aversion to people you think are extremely different from you, whether it's Muslims or gays, is broken down when you actually meet them. And so you do meet them, and they're more like normal people than you ever imagined when all you had was a kind of stereotype of them. It's true that in many rural areas, people don't necessarily meet them that often, although that's only a broad statement as well. There are many places where, there is a Tyson Foods meatpacking plant in a very rural area, and there are thousands of Somali Muslims. Those things, those things can't necessarily be divided urban by rural. But I think the issue of actually encountering people, real people, rather than just ideas about people, is really important. Yes, Habiba, is that you?
Well, actually, you always have a fascinating lecture, and this is especially interesting. Thank you very much. My question is that today we look at the pluralism, and rightly so, that is in contemporary America. But we are at least 2 centuries old, if not older, because the early pilgrims came, 2-3 centuries before that. And then we had all these people come on those slave ships, and a lot of them were Muslims.
Yes.
And then we had a lot of people come to build our railroads, and a lot of them were Chinese ancestry, and they were probably Buddhists or something akin to that. And so what I'm thinking is that since 1965, it's all come like official because of the different regulations and legislations that we have had. But we do have a prehistory of the other on our terrain. And nobody addresses that prehistory of the other. So
That is so important, actually, really important. And I think one of the things that our contemporary diversity reminds us of is that we do have a history of both the contributions of people from various parts of the world and races and cultures, but also the difficulties, the prejudice, the violence that has been part of American history. And it's one of the things that as I sort of plunged into this field and started reading the older history of America's prejudice, it was enlightening to me in the same way that you've brought up now. Absolutely important to bring up the fact that we have indigenous Muslim traditions in the U.S. Some of the estimates that, at least 10% of those who were brought here as captives from West Africa were Muslim.
I think I was working with a colleague on a project called Africa.org, and they had a list of names, and this was in one of the islands in the Caribbean, someplace. I'm not too sure where it was. So these were not people who made it to the Americas, but these were people because somewhere in the 1800s, Britain had stopped the institution of slavery. So if they found a slave ship, they would take the people off. And they had a list of names, and there's a colleague who's going through those names. And in some ships, the Muslim-sounding names are as high as 60 to 70%.
I'm sure that's true. Yeah.
So, we do not know how many actually were Muslims and what happened to their tradition.
And yeah, even when it comes all the way down to, some of the novels of Toni Morrison, for example, set in the islands off the coast of the Carolinas and Georgia, a lot of the names sort of filtered down even into contemporary times are Muslim names. Thank you so much, Habiba. Yes, in the back.
I wonder if you can tell me a bit about, since the immigration laws have adjusted to allow more Asian Islamic people into the country, we now are on to a second generation. And so I'm curious as to if there's any research that gives us an indication of whether people maintain their faith in the second generation, and are there differences amongst the religions? For example, I seem to know many Central Americans who become Jehovah's Witnesses.
Who have become,
Jehovah's Witness.
yeah.
And Bible Christians. And people from China who become Christians here. That's just, my anecdotal information. I'm just curious as to particularly the way post the changing the law, if there's any research about that, whether that second generation maintains a religion or not.
That's such a great question. And the research on that, there is very little at the moment. There's sort of anecdotal research, quote, research in some way, because a lot of the earlier generational studies of immigration in the U.S. Are really based on that period of immigration where my grandparents came, and the first generation was fairly deeply engaged in their own religious tradition. The second generation tended to reject that. The third generation began to discover their grandparents once again. But that was because there was a period between 1924 and 1965 when there was no new immigration. Now what you have are sort of still first-generation immigrants coming to, in a sense, become part of Sikh and Hindu and Muslim communities in this country. So there is a continual kind of influx of a new first generation. And what it means for second generation, because these are many of the students that I've had since about 1990, the ones who have come to college in any case, this is a new frontier. Many of them have continued to certainly identify with their religious tradition, but not in the same ways that their parents do at all. They're not as interested in the rites that take 6 hours at the temple and are involved in the recitation of the 1,000 names of Shiva over and over, or the great fire rites that take such a long time. They're much more interested in newer forms and perhaps more sort of ideational, philosophical forms of their faith, discussion of things. So it's hard to say, but it's a great question because I don't think we know. There's a lot of intermarriage, for example, in Buddhist and in Hindu and in Sikh and, of course, in Jewish and in Christian traditions. We're starting to develop a kind of multiplicity of faith even within one family and how that's going to work. I mean, we need some really good kinship studies in the U.S. But it's a great question. Thank you for that. Yes.
You mentioned before about the demographic change that took place the last 50 years. And the truth of the matter is, this is the biggest demographic change, statistically wise, in the history of the world that took place in this very country. The question is, although these changes took place and the evolution of change, the evolution in cultural change, the migrants that compose today's American society, which is much different than the society of the 60s when I came to this country. Totally different. And of course, what contributed to that was the civil rights movement and all those other movements that took place, and the ripple effects resulted in what we have today. But what is your prediction about the United States of the 2050 or 2060, the brown or gray America, if I may use a sociological terms? Is it going to be as, yes, right now there's many cultures, many people that come from different cultures that they can practice their religion even more freely than they're back in the old country, right here in the United States. But the United States also has a violent phase all over the world. Is this mixture going to create a gentler nation, a less violent nation, a more passive nation 30 or 40 years from now? That is my question. What is your prediction on
Oh,
that?
I wish I could answer. I mean, a gentler nation maybe, because we have in this country now very important ethnic and religious and cultural groups that have a stake in what happens in other parts of the world. So there is more, I mean, we are more global in that sense as well. I mean, we are sort of foreign interventions of the last 20 years have had an enormous backfire in, you know, the life of the United States, both as seen elsewhere in the world, but also in this country. So what will happen? I don't know. I mean, we can expect that as demographically people predict, that almost everywhere we will be a minority-majority society. And that includes quite a lot more Latinos and people of Asian background in this country. There's a reason for a lot of the pushback on immigration, I think, that sense that, as one writer put it about 20 years ago, that we're fast becoming an alien nation. And that's a real fear of many people. So I don't know the answer to your question. I mean, it's a disturbing one, really. That's why you asked it, right? Yes.
My question is one of the things that I think is really interesting is that Thomas Jefferson in some of his writings wrote about Hinduism. He spelled it Hindoo, but he was aware of Hinduism, Islam, and Buddhism, and wrote about that and was considering that when they were writing the First Amendment. I mean, and this is relatively, I mean, it always seems like such a surprise to people who aren't familiar with that. But the other thing that I guess my question is, what about Native American religions? Because I think they get left out completely, and in particular, you know, I mean, they've lost so much because their children were taken away and educated in primarily Christian schools where they were not allowed to practice their religion. And Jimmy Carter was the one who signed the legislation that allowed them to practice religion in this country. So, I mean, I think that, you know, we really, you know, we've lost a tremendous amount there, and we rarely talk about the indigenous religions this country. And
So important. I mean, the Native American Religious Freedom Act was sort of jaw-dropping to some people when you imagine, did they not have religious freedom before this time? No, actually, not in that sense. I come from Montana, so those issues are very much in our mind. And when the Pluralism Project did the research to produce On Common Ground, it has a very extensive section on Native people, because this was, in a sense, America's first diversity. I mean, not because they're so different one from the other. I mean, there's a huge diversity of people who were here before those folks who were seeking religious freedom, those Pilgrims and Puritans who settled in New England before they ever got here. And that aspect of American history is not something that is not noticed by other newcomers to America. I mean, there is, you know, I think in some ways among immigrants a stronger sense of awareness of Native people and some of what they've suffered in this country. I'm sure you saw the piece in the paper this last week of some school children in Georgia, I think, who had learned for the first time about the Trail of Tears and what that meant for the Native people of Georgia as they migrated to the central part of the U.S. And they started a campaign, which is still very lively, I think, about asking, why is it that Andrew Jackson is still on our $20 bill? He should not be on a piece of American currency, having done such a terrible thing. So, I mean, this is, you know, it's still in the air.
One more question.
One more question. Right in the front row. Yes, we had.
So I know you focus on the American history perspective. When I first went to Europe back in the 70s, Europe was seen as a place of tolerance and liberalism. and I have from my wife's side, I have family in Europe as well. And so when I look at Europe today, it seems to be growing intolerance and illiberalism. And so how do you see this connection of what's happening there? So today you can't build a mosque with a minaret in Switzerland.
In Switzerland, yeah, that's right.
You can't wear any kind of religious symbol in France. So how do you see this developing? So Europe has gone through a phase of becoming an a-religious continent, and we remained a fairly religious country. And I wonder if it's partly because the grounding of Americans in religion has made us to grow to more tolerant into the new religions coming in. But anyway, it's a question really for you to how do you see the European experience developing? Because right now it seems not a very good path.
It's a huge question because, you know, when de Tocqueville came to the U.S. and saw the sort of burgeoning of religion in the wake of the American Revolution, he was astonished. He said, you know, in France, religion and freedom are marching in opposite directions, and here they seem to be marching in the same direction. And part of that is because of the constitutional covenants of the Bill of Rights, the fact that you're free to practice religion. If you don't like the one that you have, you can, you know, start another branch of the Baptist Church. It's no wonder we have so many sort of sects of Baptists and Presbyterians and everyone in the U.S., because the denominationalism of American religion is really a very distinctively American phenomenon. France, in the meantime, very secular, but has spent more time talking about religion in secular France than any government in the U.S. has. I mean, they established a commission that met for years to figure out what to do about women and girls who wanted to wear the hijab in public places or in schools. They actually established a group of Muslims, a Muslim organization, to represent Islam to the French government. Now, these are things we would never think of doing in the U.S. U.S. has never had a commission to study Islam and how we should respond to Islam in our culture. So there's a kind of irony about French secularism that has made them engage with religion in all of its problematic ways in a much more strenuously. Britain, of course, is a very different thing. I mean, Britain has long had not exactly tolerance, but room for a lot of religious communities. Each of these countries is slightly different, but I think the fact that America is, as they used to say, a nation of immigrants, has made, I mean, except for the people who are already here, has made the United States a very different, I mean, there is a kind of exceptionalism about the nature of American society that is built on difference. And that hasn't been true in most of the European countries, where they've already had a strong sense of identity, national identity, that was not as fluid and is continually challenged and continually sort of having to open itself to newcomers, as the United States has. But thanks for that question. Thank you, Bruce.
Wow, that was great, and I want to thank the audience for some great questions. I mean, that's really one of the best sessions we've had. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Diana. It was really wonderful. It's incredibly insight. I mean, I do a lot of work in this area, but I was really surprised by some of those slides and you know, just the diversity that is around. It is absolutely amazing. We are all affected by this in our workplace and communities. And the understanding of it's really necessary to living in this increasingly pluralistic society. I personally feel there are many paths to God, and religious literacy is the subject that the sun is about to rise on here. The series is sponsored by the Religious Literacy Foundation, and also another worthy cause is the Pluralism Project. So, you know, if you all can, yeah, we're both about the same thing. So anyway, thank you all for coming out tonight. That was really wonderful. And Diana, thank you very much again for a great stimulus.